Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. This is Adam Huss coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Thank you so much for listening. If you're listening for the first time, I should probably mention that though the title of this podcast makes it sound like this podcast is about organic wine, it's actually about the ecology of wine, the future of wine, and the regenerative revolution as seen through the lens of wine. If you're ready to go on a journey that leaves traditional wine thought far behind and explores the edges and margins of viticulture that can change the way we not only grow wine, but the way we think and understand our role as part of the ecosystem of wine, then this podcast will probably light your fire. If you'd like to support this podcast and the work that goes into each episode, we have a Patreon page, and you can link from the show notes and subscribe, and that would be much appreciated. If you'd like to sponsor an episode, I'm looking for sponsors. Please email me at info@centraliswine.com. That's info@centralaswine.com. And last but definitely not least, a great review on iTunes or any podcast service is immensely helpful. Thank you so much for your support. My guest for this episode is Mark Shepard. I'm so excited to share this conversation with you because Mark has a perspective on viticulture and agriculture in general that is revolutionary, while also being incredibly commonsensical. He's as funny as he is passionate, and that passion comes from wanting to share an incredibly important message, not only for producing wine, but also for our survival. Mark is the author of Restoration Agriculture, which is a top 10 Amazon bestseller in multiple categories. Restoration Agriculture is his term for eco-mimicry permaculture or multi-story perennial polyculture using what thrives naturally in your ecosystems. He practices this at scale on his 110-acre new forest farm in Wisconsin and on several other properties, and he provides agricultural consulting around the planet. One of the quotes from his book that stood out to me is when he's talking about the conventional monoculture approach and says, "We have created the conditions under which pests and diseases thrive while almost completely ceasing the improvement of the crop's own resistance to the threats we've created." This is so true in wine, where we have a global monoculture of a handful of European grapes that have been propagated by cloning for 200 years or more now. And in the last 50 years, we've spent literally billions of dollars developing chemicals to enable these clones to survive while investing incredibly little in breeding new varieties that don't need the chemicals, or in expanding the idea of wine to include other ingredients besides European grapes. Mark doesn't spray his fruit, whether it's apples or cherries or chestnuts or grapevines. He employs a kind of vitiforestry, and his approach to agriculture illuminates some incredible perspective shifts in how we could think about growing grapevines differently, as well as how we could think about wine differently, as one symbiotic element in a holistic perennial polyculture. Albert Einstein said, and this is a quote you've probably heard, it's become a little cliche, but it's very true. We cannot solve the significant problems we face at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. Mark provides perspectives that I think are necessary to move to a new level of thinking, and I think they can revolutionize the way that you see viticulture. Enjoy. Mark, welcome. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
Great. I mean, I definitely want to continue what we were talking about. What was the last thing that you said?
I was going to say, well, why don't you tell your audience what we were doing for the past 20 minutes before you hit record?
Yes, we were talking about variety and grape variety and the fact that as much as, you know, there's this obsession with it, with labeling, and I think the consumer, I mean, so, you know, at Centralis, my winery, I've stopped using varieties, and now the biggest discussion that I have with people is like, I pour my wine for them and they say, "Oh, what is it?" And what they mean is, "What's the variety of grape?" And
Okay,
I
so
say, "Well, we don't list varieties."
You stopped labeling the varieties of grapes that you use.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not that you're not using varieties of grapes.
Yes, but also in some cases, like in one case last year I worked with a grape that honestly the variety is uncertain, unknown, so don't know what it is for sure. And then I do some weird blends with like prickly pears and stuff like that. So it's sort of like you're going to get, even if you knew the variety that I blended with the prickly pears, it might not mean anything to you because the flavor of the wine is going to be so different than
Right.
what that variety tastes like.
Because one of the things that I do like, I told you, but I didn't tell everybody else here, is I ran a hard cider winery here for 10 years off a New Forest farm. It was back when we could self deliver, and I had a capacity of about 100 cases a week. And as long as I could, ferment it, blend it, bottle it, and deliver it myself to town, it was profitable because we're a small scale operation. Um, but a new governor took power, and they immediately forced us to go through a distributor. And I had
Yeah.
enough sales to justify upscaling and borrowing the money, build a factory and all that kind of stuff. But I didn't want to go there. I got a cute little 16 by 32 tasting room. I've got two primary fermenters and two conditioning tanks, and that's good enough for me. And so I just quit. It was too much of a hassle for the size that I was at. But
And
the
you couldn't make it.
individual variety of the apple that I used or the other fruits that I used, the individual variety had almost everything to do with, the flavor, the alcohol content, all these different other components of the experience when you're drinking, a hard cider. The variety of fruit really mattered a lot. But I
Yes.
didn't I didn't feel the need to put it on a bottle, to put that on the label.
Yes, absolutely. Right. No, I agree. I mean, this variety does matter in terms of flavor and everything else. What I'm concerned about is sort of approaching winemaking from this earth first perspective, from the, yeah, from coming from the living world rather than from a market and commoditization of the product. And, sort of embracing what you I think espouses this idea of it's a process of adaptation and selection. And so those varieties are going to change with the conditions of the living world as the living world conditions change, because we're going to find new things that thrive, that do better. And I want us to have that freedom. Whereas, right now, frankly, like the wine industry is essentially a global monoculture of a handful of European grapes that have been
Right.
cloned for 200 years. And I mean, and that's not talking about cider. I mean, cider has a little bit of that, although, you know, I'm sure you've found that people care less about apple variety because they don't know it as well. They don't realize that it's like grapes and that those varieties, and I think it gives cider makers that freedom to sort of just blend and have, a dozen different varieties and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, so I
And
guess that's
part
where
of
I was going.
I think part of having, the variety of grape listed on the wine and declared, I think part of that is it allows people who don't really have a lot of experience with growing grapes and, fermenting their own wine. It gives them just an extra little, piece of expertise that they know something, and that's important because, really historically, wine and wine tasting has had a rather elitist flair to it. And so if anybody can come in and say, oh, I'd like a XYZ PDQ variety, they know something. And I think that's really important for the customer to know something. But like to go
Hmm.
back to what you were saying earlier, is that the freedom and the adaptiveness, my whole approach, the whole restoration agriculture approach, is to, over time, as we run our agricultural business, the individual plants, whether they're grapes or apples or blackberries, whatever it is, the genetics of those plants that survive, um, they change because the ones with characteristics that make them troublesome, they get this kind of pest, this kind of disease. They need extra water. The flavor's not quite right. They don't ripen as fast. Whatever the characteristics are, the ones that aren't adapted to the site, they disappear. They no longer are in the gene pool. They don't reproduce with your population on site. And so, as the climate changes, weather patterns changes, pest and disease population pressure changes, the individual plants that are growing on my property, they come and go. And if you were to taste a cider made in 2022, it does not taste like the cider that was made in 2006 because we have different individual apple trees now that are the ones that are producing the majority of our crop, and the
Right.
majority of all the different plants that I'm working with, the majority of them are seedlings. I do have
Right.
individual varieties, individuals that we've vegetatively propagated because they have some sort of characteristic that we either want to have represented at a higher proportion in the breeding population, or a flavor characteristic that is just really fantastic, or in the case with uh, two varieties, I think they were Purdue varieties of apples, Liberty and Priscilla. They are bomb proof. There's like hardly any insects bother them, hardly any diseases bother them. They just grow perfectly well with sheer total utter neglect. And I want their pollen to get into the seeds of my other apples because I'm planting apple seeds to grow into rootstock, that I either, while I do, I'll graft the top with a variety that I like, but I'll let one side branch grow on its own. And as it proves itself through time, um, we may cut the variety, the known variety, off and leave our seedling variety. And in the
Mm.
past 25 years of doing fruit here on the farm, there are four apples that right now are that we call separate varieties. They got their own separate names. They have their own separate characteristics. So it's just like any other variety that you would have out there. Um,
But they were developed by you guys on the farm.
correct, correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
So
guys,
and that
me guys.
you I didn't know if you wanted to use the royal we or just yeah, yeah. So by you. Um well, and that gets back to I think right before I pressed record, what we had gotten into is consistency and this idea of consistency. And I I get that as well. Like that seems to be this drive that people have in terms of the market and everything like that, is that they have this, an old friend that they can return to in their
Right.
glass every time they buy that bottle. I think, but you could probably, I mean, and that's the challenge. I mean, do you have any thoughts to say about that? I should just,
Well, because it's really tough. I got started in the whole cider thing just before the whole cider renaissance happened in the U.S.
yeah,
And I grew up in apple country, excuse me, in the Northeast, and I drank all kinds of stuff ever since my hands were big enough to pick up apples. I was drinking, hard cider, and there's some really challenging material. And what I never knew until I actually, trained in enology, I never knew that there were ways to change the flavor once you fermented it. Because if
hmm,
you get a really good press of juice, and I'm going to use a Haralson apple, the variety Haralson, you press that and you ferment it till it's still and dry. It's like a really nice, pleasant white wine. And I thought that that's what cider was. It was either this really nice, pleasant white wine, or it was all these various different stages of drac before it got to white wine, or where it
hmm.
veered off course. Um,
Right,
and then once I started selling commercially, the whole woodchuck craze happened, and um, one particular consultant is the blending master for most of the major cider operations around the world, and it all ends up tasting like a Magner's or a Bulmer's cider. Well, then in the U.S. it ends up being sweeter. Now, that's not that the cider makers have to do that. You can do taste test after taste test after taste test, and the American consumer wants to have their, Mott's apple juice from their little sippy cup when they had it as a little kid. They want some bubbles in it and some alcohol, and it's like, as a
right,
cider drinker, I like the real adventurous stuff, the wild
yeah,
ferments and, all kinds of weird off tones, but that just doesn't sell. And
yeah,
so the cider maker in me wanted to go just wild and crazy, but I was forced to blend to meet a certain, identity that it has to taste like this.
yeah, yeah. That is tough, but I feel like that is changing. I mean, maybe not so much in rural Wisconsin, but I feel like there there are populations now who crave that same experience that you wanted, the wild and woolly cider experience, and it seems to be growing. I mean, it seems like incrementally growing, sort of like anything. It's new, it's different, it's dry, it's wild, but uh, it's getting some following, I think.
And just about every cider maker that I know, they have their steady Eddie cider that works. That's the stuff that actually drives the train. And then they go, oh, try this and try this and try that. And so they have the opportunity to introduce, different flavors to folks.
Yeah.
And actually,
Well,
I don't see enough of that with like the grape wines. I do a decent amount of work in California, and some in Southern Europe. And what I don't see are a lot of wineries trying to push the envelope when you go to the tasting room. I'd like to see that with the grape
mm,
wineries.
well, you just brought up that you're working in all these areas. What are you doing when you're working there?
That's a great question. It actually varies wherever I go. There are some places that want to convert from their high chemical intensity full tillage operation to a more organic or natural or biodynamic, whatever you want to call those kind of systems.
Hmm.
So that's some of it. Some folks, and recently it's been more of this, is they want to address uh, rainwater and runoff management because
Uh,
water is such a critical, important issue. And then others in Europe, it was mostly working with folks who wanted to work more with polycultures in the vineyard, um, and that was a lot of fun.
yeah,
So
that's
what I
great.
do, what I do varies.
Gotcha. Well, one thing that you've done is written this book, Restoration Agriculture, which I read, and I wanted to thank you for that because in addition to being a really great practical resource for, I guess, what you would call restoration agriculture, but is like multi-story perennial polyculture at scale. It was so commonsensical to me that it was like revolutionary. I don't know if you've gotten that comment before, but it's sort of like, what you're doing isn't common, but it's common. But what you're suggesting is so common sense as a solution to the problems of what is the dominant form of agriculture right now.
Right. And,
Um,
and and the basic premise of a restoration agriculture is we're going to go wherever we go and we're going to do our agriculture thing. And
right.
we look around us, we do some research. Well, what has been here for the past, zillion years? What are the plant community types that were there? And then in that group of species, you pick out the ones that are marketable, and you pick out tall trees, medium trees, short trees, vines, canes, ground covers, shade tolerance, fungi, animals. And then once you pick those species out, manage your water resource so that rainwater is captured, and either stored somehow or spread out and soaked in, depending on your context. Uh, and then we attempt to mimic that plant community's natural disturbance pattern that through the hundreds of thousands or zillions of years that community type has been in the area. Maybe it's a place that's um, heavily influenced by lots of windstorms or fire or flood or huge herds of animals that come through and trample the crap out of everything. So we try to imitate the disturbance pattern of that plant community when we actually go in and manage it. So what ends
Mm,
up happening is we create a closely mimicked natural system so that if we want to, we can walk away from it and it will be there for the next zillennia. And what it will do is it will regenerate itself, which means after a disturbance, let's say that fire comes through Paradise, California, naturally, locally, regionally adapted plant community will maybe the individual plant won't survive, but its propagules will. It'll either sprout back from the roots. Its seeds, some plants need fire in order for seeds to open. But those plants in that area are naturally adapted to whatever that place can throw at it, and they reproduce themselves. These systems expand. And if you take a broccoli farm, and it could be the most certified organic regenerative broccoli farm that you've ever seen. If a fire comes through and burns that broccoli farm to the ground, you will not get any regeneration of broccoli. And that's the ecological definition of regeneration. So even though you have
Right.
the certification that says you're a regenerative broccoli farm, it's not, because it will not regenerate. So if we go to uh, any wine growing region around the world, the grapes that lived there and live there now have certain adaptations to that weather pattern, pest and disease cycles, the temperature of the seasons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And even as climate changes, and when climate changes, because they're allowed to reproduce, they're not just clones, monoculture clones of the next lot. You allow them to reproduce. The ones that survive are now adapted to the new conditions. So it's a
Yep.
continually adapting natural plant community mimic. Whew, that was a lot of words.
Yeah. I love that. And so I guess my question is, you maybe don't realize how weird that sounds to some people. I wonder, can you think back to how and when and what triggered this transition in your thinking from I'm sure it was a process, but I don't know, was there a moment or a series of moments that you can recall vividly where this clicked in for you, where it was, instead of thinking about, clearing the land and putting in an annual conventional crop as a form of agriculture, to looking at the land and working with what's there? I mean, was
It,
there,
yeah,
what
it was
was
like
that transition?
it was like a time period in my life, probably between 8 years old and middle teens. Because once I got to the middle teens, I had already been changed in a way I went. But
Oh.
it was the early 1970s. There was the oil embargo. OPEC nations cut off our oil supply, and within a short period of time, gasoline was rationed. And where I was at, we were allowed to get 5 gallons of gas, uh, and only on every other day based on your license plate, if it's an odd number or an even number. And the gas lines got huge, and my parents immediately had to change. Everything they did. They started gardening in earnest. They used to have like a little garden patch out back. So then pretty soon we were up to like a half acre, 3/4 of an acre of a garden. Um, they bought a little Volkswagen for the fuel efficiency. They got a wood stove for heating the house. Well, a garden. Let's see. I'm 6 foot tall and about 250 pounds, and I'm the smallest of three brothers. So you can imagine that we could shovel down the food. So here we had the biggest garden around. My dad actually was he worked for a doctor as a child, and the doctor taught him how to compost, because back then doctors were botanists and all that. And so
Hmm.
he was one of these composting weirdos and was doing stuff organic back when, if you said the word organic, literally you could get arrested for being a socialist. So here he was, one of the world's finest organic gardeners in his day, and with like an acre and a half worth of garden, we still had to go to the grocery store to buy our staple foods, our carbohydrates, proteins, and our oil, our bread, our pasta, our meat. Um, and because I was the oldest and most responsible, now, I don't know about you, but if you were the oldest child, who taught you to be responsible, and how do you know how to be responsible? So,
Hmm.
but anyways, I was supposed to be responsible, and I was the one who was the primary market garden slave. And so I'd be out working in the garden, hoeing, weeding, making compost, hauling compost. In a garden, of course, it's out in the hot sun. I'm getting covered with dirt and dust and working my arse off. But as soon as my time was up, I could put those tools down and I ran off to the woods. In the woods, I'm in the shade. I'm picking grapes and blueberries and strawberries and wild onions and all kinds of different roots that are out there, and hickory nuts and hazelnuts. And I started to gather all these seeds and make a hyper dense area of all these wild food plants. And I realized that work in a semi-natural system, farming work in a semi-natural system, basically meant going out and harvesting this in order to make the conditions better for that. So every time I'd go into the woods, I'm doing some sort of work, but it's benefiting the next thing, and I'm getting a yield when I'm doing work instead of just pointless work. And maybe at the end of the season, I get a couple carrots that stroll through the soup. I had something to eat as soon as things greened up in the spring, all the way until Christmas time. There'd be something to eat out in the woods, and it dawned on me. It's like, well, why aren't we growing our gardens more like a forest or a forested edge, and less like this, bombed out nuclear wasteland where we kill absolutely everything except for the carrots and tomatoes.
Right.
And
Yeah,
and the
that
rest
makes,
is a beautiful, long, sordid history of uh, trial by doing it.
yeah. Now, do you give the trees in that forest any credit for trying to speak to you? I mean, do you have a spiritual connection in that sense? I don't know what the best word is. Maybe metaphysical connection is a
Well,
better
and,
word.
and actually, I think that's I have an understanding of what it is that you're attempting to ask. And I also understand what you tried to clarify, because oftentimes when we talk about things like that, you may know what you're talking about and what you're asking. I may think that I know what you're talking about, but what I'm thinking that you're talking about is different than what you are actually thinking about, because we're not clear on what those terms actually are.
Yeah.
But I have found through experience that when you actually observe nature, do your best to imitate it, and then you have a active relationship with it and you interact with it, not as a domineering force telling it what to do, but as a participant. When you have a relationship with a natural system, or your vineyard, you will learn things that you won't find in textbooks.
Yeah.
How's
I
that
like
for a
that.
safe answer?
That's good. That's a safe answer.
So maybe my answer was yes, because how would I have learned this stuff unless I learned from the system itself?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
whether that system was created, adapted, evolved, happened by accident, or is a simulation in a computer somewhere, I learned from it.
Yeah. Yep. That's great. Um,
And I'm going to use that as a jumping off point. No
please.
matter where you live, whether it's in the desert of New Mexico, or dry California, or the humid Seattle, well, used to be humid Seattle, or any other humid states where you might be, look at the ditch on the side of the road. There are things growing in the ditch on the side of the road. Who planted them there? Who did the soil preparation? Who did the cover crops? Who did the pest control, disease control, fertilizer? Who did the subsoiling? Who did the subsoil drainage? And who did the irrigation? Nobody did anything to the ditch on the side of the road except maybe mow it, hit it with an herbicide, or crash a car on it on Friday night when you've had too much wine at the wine tasting. That ditch on the side of the road is a model of a absolutely sustainable, locally adapted agriculture. And if you go to that ditch on the side of the road, you will find plants that are edible, fermentable, medicinal, weavable into some sort of basket product, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah.
that's where the lessons are. And everybody can see the ditch on the side of the road, and it's telling you how to live where you live. And it might not be native plants too. It might be all crazy with these non-native plants that are thriving quite well. Well, they're telling us something too.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Um, well, and in this system, let's talk. Can we talk about New Forest Farm and what that looks like as well, just to give people a sense of what scale you're working at personally?
This property is 110 acres. There are other properties that I own and manage, um, but this one is 110 New Forest Farm, and it's located uh, in the southwestern left side of Wisconsin. If you were to go east of the Iowa-Minnesota border, you go about 30 miles into Wisconsin. It's located right there.
Gotcha.
It's a pocket of Wisconsin that was not glaciated in the past few ice ages, and it's if you can imagine a Grand Canyon, but have it in the central U.S. And because there's enough rainfall, all of the sides of the canyon walls are vegetated. So it's a humid eastern deciduous type of forest type in this canyon lands, and you can't get there from here because every road is crooked. There's not a straight road for 50 miles of this place,
Got it.
and it is the heartland of the oak savanna plant community type.
Mm.
And the oak savanna was characterized by fairly wide spaced trees, in part because fire was very common. Many folks in California are familiar with all these, wide spaced oak trees with all the grasses underneath.
Yep.
Some of the other plants that were always found with the oaks, um, and included with the oaks, I'll put the other Fagaceae, oak, chestnut, and beech. All three of those are tall growing trees. They produce nuts. The beech and the oak have a high oil, higher protein nut. Chestnut is more of a grain equivalent that grows on a tree, and it's a highly perishable seed. then there were um, prunices. There were cherries. Tall cherry trees, medium sized cherry trees, bush cherries, ground growing cherries. Um, that were part of the system. There were malices and crataeguses, so apples and hawthorns that were growing wild in the system. There were hazelnut was the dominant shrub in the area. Then there were cane fruits, raspberries and blackberries. There were shade tolerants such as currants and gooseberries, grapes climbing all over the whole mess,
Yeah.
grass and flowers all over the place, and animals, 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 animals. Around the
Yeah.
world, savanna is the biome that supports more mammal biomass than any other place, more than the forest and more than grasslands. And the oak savanna here was it was the richest, moistest, largest extent oak savanna on the planet. And guess what the dominant grazing animals were right here in southwest Wisconsin?
Bison?
They were actually mastodons. Yeah, the
Mastodons.
Boaz mastodon skeleton was found just 5 miles south of here, and it was the skeleton that laid to rest the question of whether human beings actually hunted and ate mastodons, because there were cut marks all over the place, probably teeth
Ah,
marks too, and human tools
right.
all over the place when they found it. And so this place is like the Serengeti of North America. And what's interesting about the savanna, it's a very unstable phase somewhere between grassland and closed canopy forest.
Right.
It's unstable, but it's incredibly resilient. It can handle wind, ice, snow, lightning strike, fire, huge herds of bison, mastodons knocking trees over and all that. And it just keeps coming back and keeps coming back. But it requires the disturbance to stay in that phase. Same is true with the like the California oak savannas. Once it gets all clogged up with brush, it becomes a fire hazard, and then it can
Yep.
burn everything down, and then it gets stuck, and it can't get back into that oak savanna phase because those original conditions were messed with. So it requires a certain degree of almost constant disturbance to keep it in that phase. But in
Right.
that phase, it's in a constant state of aggradation, which means the soil is constantly improving, and the O and the A horizon of the soil is getting deeper and deeper and deeper, until in some cases, between here and Chicago, there was topsoil that was 200 feet deep. And what's interesting about that topsoil is it developed without earthworms. They were not native to this area at all. So it was that plant
Huh.
community and those animals and all the disturbances, the wind and the fire, et cetera, for, 93 to 95 million years that created topsoil that deep. And we come in there, we plow it up in 60, 70 years, blow it all away, and then we're hooked on chemical fertilizers. All we have left is the mineral dust.
Right. And so again, why it's so common sense to not do that and to do what you're doing, which is to try to replicate what it was already doing successfully for millennia.
Right.
Um,
And then that's what makes it so easy, because the species that I chose, geez, you can hear what I said, chestnut, cherries, apples, hazelnuts, grapes, currants, animals, that's called agriculture. Every
yeah,
single one of those things right there, we don't have to create new markets for it. We don't have to convince somebody to try this new crazy food. It's all common human food that people around the world recognize as food. And I may not get top yields of anything because there are competitive effects between different species. Um, but because it's a natural system, my input costs drop almost to zero. And many of my of what a vineyard owner would experience as an input cost, I actually get to experience as a revenue stream. If you take a natural system like I described, the oak savanna, and you say, I like the grapes, I'm going to take only grapes and plant only grapes all by themselves. Now, what you've done is you've taken it out of its natural ecological context. All of the things that nature, natural processes, and natural systems used to do, you now have to do. You now have to take care of the disease populations. You have to take care of the pest populations. You have to make sure that the ground cover doesn't get so rampant and rank that it overtakes your crop. So you have to do some kind of weed control. There's all these different, and then the soil, you no longer have the full complete complex of soil creation, petogenesis. Um, you don't have that process in place anymore. So now you're responsible for the fertility in the soil. So if we go back
yeah,
to that natural system, put all those pieces in place, we have soil that creates itself and gets more fertile through time and holds more water in a non-saturated way. And we have pest and disease cycles that come into balance with one another. And we eventually, as our crops mature, we find a steady state yield that is predictable year after year after year. It fluctuates up and down and so on. We end up with a very predictable yield, minimal input costs, and it regenerates itself, which is also part of the program because we want to constantly be breeding forward. In reality, we don't have like these stainless steel laboratories and greenhouses with lights and one pollen grain crossed with that and put a bag over the top. It's like, no, 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 no. This is wild reproduction, the way all these plants originally were adapted to be.
yeah,
We just take the seeds and we plant the seeds. And guess what? Not all of the seeds are exactly like their parent. And that's the whole point of sexual reproduction, is we're rolling the genetic dice as many times as we possibly can to come up with the genetic variants that will survive whatever the climate's throwing at us next.
right.
And it's
You,
delicious.
yeah. Well, okay, so I'm going to get some. I want to get practical. I want to get into grapes specifically, but just in terms of looking at 110 acres where you're practicing this kind of agriculture, and a lot, obviously you can control the animals that you're adding to that landscape in terms of pigs or geese or turkeys or whatever it is. What about the wildlife, and how do you manage that situation where clearly if you have deer, those deer are going to want to eat your grapes and your apple tree, especially if they're young things. Are you excluding or using deer fences or using other forms of exclusion to protect young plants as you're establishing different parts of your system?
In the early years, we did it with numbers. It was just sheer numbers of plants. I'll use sweet corn as an example. If you plant a 10 by 10 patch of sweet corn, the raccoons will eat absolutely every single ear. If you plant a 10-acre patch of sweet corn, they'll get like the outer 4 or 5 rows, and so you get even
Gotcha.
more, per acre. If you plant 100 acres, you have even less of a percentage of predation. So getting the
Right.
numbers out there was part of it. It was also distraction and diversion. And
Mm.
before planting, I spent like the winter and the season just wandering around and seeing where all the different animal trails were, and some of the things that deer, especially because they're the biggest threat to young seedlings, young
Yeah.
trees and vines. I would find out where their trails went. They need food, they need water, they want some shelter. So you find a thicket over here of some wild roses that have grown up. It's like, okay, there I've got some shelter. Now why don't I go ahead and plant some very delicious trees, hybrid poplars and hybrid willows, right alongside their trail, going right over to this thicket, and at that thicket dig a hole in the ground, and when it rains, that hole fills up full of water. Now they got food, they got water, they got shelter. And so how that worked out in practical terms, planting out the system, is as I'm planting a row of chestnuts, for example, all of a sudden, whoever's riding on the transplant machine sees a blue flag in the ground. They know that, oh, got to switch off and put in, poplars and willows and poplars and willows. And
Ah,
so, to this day, there is a major wildlife corridor that goes right through the farm, and it has all kinds of habitat stuff. It's improved deer habitat. So in the first few years, they're going along this little trail where they're used to going. They're eating some willows. They're getting some water. They're hiding in the in the rose bushes and all that. Then as time goes on, a few years go by, my trees are big enough that they're not going to get destroyed by all the deer. Plus, they're hanging
uh-huh.
out in their happy zone anyways. They want to hang out where their ponds are and their shelter is. They're creatures of habit. So that was the main way of dealing with it. Well, once upon a time, this farm was the place where the deer went through to get from one habitat area to another habitat area. Now it happens to be the farm where the deer come from,
Right.
and they are everywhere, and some beauties, real beauties.
Right, right.
So when I plant new trees now, in years past, I'm planting tens of thousands at a time. Well, now I'm just doing replacements. So I'll go wipe out a block that's not productive, and I'll go stick in a few hundred replacements. I use on full size trees, chestnuts and oaks and cherries and whatnot. I'll use a 5 foot tree tube, and on hazelnuts I'll use 2 foot, 2.5 foot tree tubes. I use Tree Pro tree tubes. They're the ones they're less likely to bend in the wind. That seems to be the biggest issue with the tree tubes here.
Okay.
I
Gotcha.
used
Yeah, the
repellents for a while. I used like the hot pepper wax, and on those days they were eating Mexican. I used garlic, garlic oil. Then they were eating Italian, and it just never worked.
have did you tried the wolf urine?
I all kinds of urine. I used hair from the barbershop. Actually, what did work fairly well, and it was really affordable, was I just take a dozen eggs, lob it in a 5 gallon bucket of water, and just use that as a splash. It wasn't rotten or anything. It just, I don't know if it masked the scent, or they just didn't like the scent, and that worked pretty good. And it was only
Huh.
critical times a year, because once again, I'm having a relationship with this place, and I'm finding out there's no damage, no damage. All of a sudden, wow, it just starts happening all at once. So then I could figure out what the timing was of when to go ahead and apply, so I didn't have to do it all the time.
As far as I know, you have some unique experience growing grapes in this kind of multi-story perennial polyculture, biomimicry system. And I mean, even though this is how vines evolved, and there's an ancient tradition of doing this pretty much anywhere vines grow, I don't really know anyone else in North America that's doing it, at least at the scale that you're doing it. Um, is that? Do you know of any other sort of
I
grow.
know backyard, homesteader folks who are doing it,
Yeah,
using
yeah,
trees as trellises, but to do it at any scale, I don't, and um, I once again I learned it by default. I in restoration agriculture, I write this cute story about my dad got like 6 grapevines, and he made these trellis posts out of concrete, and he got the high tensile wire to hold it all in place. And central Massachusetts very humid, and every year would go by, you'd see the vertical posts just lean a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more until thump, they fall over. And it's like as soon as you put a trellis in the ground, it's in the process of falling apart.
right.
Whereas a tree, you put it in the ground, you put the grapes on the tree. The tree's always getting better and better until maybe 50, 75, 100, 3,000 years later, it does start to go into decline. And
Right.
the biggest comment that I get are from people who've seen grapes climbing all over trees in the wild. And they say, yeah, but how do you pick the grapes? They're like, 100 feet up in the air. And then how do you prevent the grapes from strangling the branches, or in a heavy load of fruit breaks branches and destroys the tree? So you have neither grapes nor trees. And it's like, well, if you want to have really good, high quality grapes, you're going to do a little pruning in your
Yeah.
vineyard to get more sunlight, more airflow, disease prevention and good ripening, blah, blah. Well, and if you want to have good fruit, you're going to be pruning your tree. So instead of spending time pruning an acre of vineyard and then an acre of orchard, why not spend the same amount of time pruning a vinorchard, the combined system? And
Vineyard
it's
orchard.
not that difficult. You just you leave on your fruit tree the lower branches as a scaffold, and then you drape the vine on the lower branches. Um, so and so this is another thing that shows that I'm not like a California vineyardist. Is to me it's the vine, the branches, and the canes. I don't know what you guys call it. Um,
Yeah.
the main vine, when I'm planting the trees, I'll go ahead and I'll plant them all at the same time. And if I want my grapes this far apart, just on the transplanter, I know that when I hit this tree, I'm going to put a grape and a tree, a grape and a tree. And so in the early years, like say 2 or 3 years, um, the vine is basically just growing. It's not really going to be doing much fruiting, and you're just fattening up the trunk of that vine. Then once the
Right.
tree is up a little bit, you can just hang the vine over the lowest branches on that tree. Then you can start to prune it for your side branches and then your canes. And
And so
go ahead.
you're planting them at the same time, the
Yeah.
tree and the vine.
Yep.
Okay. I and
At
here
first, when
I
setting
would.
it up, that's what I do. Is at first, yes.
Okay. Because I just would imagine, and you're, what trees are you working with mainly, or have you experimented with a bunch of different ones?
Name your tree that will grow, and I've got grapes on it. Um, the ones that the grapes seem, for some reason, really, really, really do well on is mulberry, and I don't know why. I don't care. I
Mulberry.
just really do. The ones that I prefer the grapes on most are apples. The reason why I
Okay.
prefer the apples is because I do lightly prune my apples, so it'll be convenient for me to move animals through the system, to harvest, to do site prep before harvesting, etc. And so I'm in there doing a little pruning ahead of time on the apples and the grapes at the same time. Whereas in the mulberries here I'm using mostly for pig feed,
Uh
and
huh.
the grapes will climb all the way up the top of the mulberry trees, and eventually I'll all of a sudden realize that they're out of reach. And it's not
Right.
necessarily my reach that I care about, it's the pigs. And so the technique I used as a little kid, when the grapes would be way up the top of the tree, I was a pretty heavy kid. I'd try to climb the grapevine, and the grapevine would get pulled down and fall on the ground. And so that's all I do on the mulberries or any of the wild trees, oaks or maples or whatever. I'll just pull the vines down after I realize that I've let them get out of control.
Gotcha. And And leave them on the ground, or what happens at that point? You
Well,
stop growing?
I'll cut them and drape it over the lowest branch of whatever the tree is,
Got it.
and then I take the trimmings and I put them in the alley between rows, and then that'll get chipped. Probably the most useful, expensive piece of equipment that I have is a heavy duty orchard mower, flail chopper. Mine's a
Flail chopper,
Berti
yeah.
from Italy, and I can shred sticks, 4 inches in diameter with that thing. And so I
Wow,
put
okay.
everything in the alley in the middle. And typically, what I do is at least once a year, I mow immediately next to whatever the crop tree is, and primarily that's done just before harvest. So
Gotcha.
if you come out here when it's nowhere near grape harvest, there's going to be a tangle of vines and dead sticks all over the place, and you're like, wow, this place is a mess. And then just before, like a couple weeks before harvest, I'll go through, I'll chip everything up. And what happens is after a few years, I think it was like 7 or 8 years before things really started to kick in. I can take a tremendous amount of woody material and chip it all up, and except for the biggest chunks, it'll all be gone next year. It just decomposes
Wow.
so fast. So that's the energy, mostly carbon in your woody debris, but that's the energy for your decay cycle. And
Yeah.
I also like to influence the decay cycle. And so when I'm going through an area, I'll be trimming out larger branches. I'll be putting those in the bucket of the tractor for inoculation later on with preferred mushroom spawn. Most of the mushrooms that I'll inoculate most trees with are oyster mushroom. It'll go on almost everything. Oaks and
Yeah.
chestnut I'll use. Shiitake, maples I'll use lion's mane. I have a lot of European black alder that's pretty vigorously reproducing out here, and I do shiitakes on that mostly.
Mm.
And then on the ground before I chip the branches, I'll scatter sawdust spawn of wine cap stropharia. And so
Oh,
what
yeah.
I'm doing is I'm going in as I'm doing some pruning, which is helping my grapes, which is also helping my apples. Now I'm going to chip all that debris, which will help get rid of disease and parasitic and saprocytic fungi that may affect my trees and my vines. It'll also help with the fertility of the soil. I'm adding all this wood chip mulch directly to the soil, which decomposes using mushrooms that I can then harvest later on in the season. So I've just taken how many different things just by going in
Yeah.
and pruning once. I've set up at least 4 different revenue streams, because also what happens is the grass now flourishes and it grows like crazy. It's got an extra shot of fertilizer, more nutrient, more water available to it, more sunshine now. And so it grows like crazy. Well, geez, I got to get it mowed. So I move the cattle in, and then I'll after I harvest, is when we'll move pigs in to go clean up any fruit, because we'll go through and harvest the perfect fruit, because we don't spray anything. We're certified organic for 26 years, and never sprayed anything for anything. And so when you're picking fruit or vegetables for that matter, if it's not perfect, would throw it on the ground. Now, your
Right.
conventional orchardist would say, you can't do that. All the diseases and the pests will spread. The insects will crawl out and pupate in the soil. It's like, well, look, I go through, I harvest, and there are, grapes or apples all over the ground. And I move the pigs in, and there won't be any grapes or apples there tomorrow. So the
Right.
cattle are mowing my grass. They're adding, 35 gallons of urine a day, and I think it's like 72 cow patties a day off of one cow. So if that's happening, early in the
What?
season, so I have enough time with the animals off and they're not in the system during the middle of the summer, then I go through and harvest in the fall, and then move animals again back in after I've harvested. I get my fertilizer shot, I get my grass mowed for me. Both of those are now revenue streams instead of expenses.
And so you're not doing any, I'm guessing you're pulling the cows out early enough because of the organic certification
Yeah,
to meet that yeah, that gap of time, whatever, 120 days before harvest.
and then they go
What about
they go somewhere else, in the meantime.
right, got it. And do you in that time, do you have any? I mean, it seems like the grass would be growing quite a bit during that time. Are you just mowing, or
Nothing.
what's happening?
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay.
No.
Oh, okay, great.
See,
Gotcha.
and the
So when you come through
the
with the
cattle
flail
went to
mower,
market. The cattle went to market this year before we harvested all of the apples, and so my main apple growing area on the farm, it's a jungle out there. It's like head high grass.
right? Okay. Amazing. Does that cause any challenges
What
or
happens?
opportunities?
What it well, see, that's the thing is what it does is it creates conditions that we then adapt to. Instead of saying
Okay.
something's good or bad, it just creates different conditions. So some of the conditions that it has created out there is the ground will not freeze as quickly, so I'll probably have a better survival of younger trees or trees that overbore and are kind of uh, wobbly nutritionally wise. Will it also mean I'll have more pests overwintering because I also didn't get the pigs out there after the apples because they went to slaughter. We had a heck of an apple year this year. I've never seen so many apples on the trees. So it
Wow.
creates new conditions, and then we just kind of roll with it next year.
Got it. All right. Well, back to
Go back to the ditch on the side of the road. Do you really
yeah.
care? Do you really care about what's going on in the ditch on the side of the road? That's how little I care about all these different issues that people get all their undies in a bunch about.
Gotcha.
I'm
Yeah.
not going to get
Yeah.
I'm not going to get 45 million pounds per square inch of whatever the crop is that you're looking for. I'm getting
Right.
at the bottom end of the yield scale, but I don't care because my expenses are below the bottom end of the yield scale.
And you're getting probably in total, if you add up all of the low level productivity of the crops, you have a total productivity from multi crops that is superior.
Yeah,
I would bet.
the agroforestry world uses a term called the land equivalent ratio. I just wrote an article about this today actually. And if you grow an acre of corn, you'll get a full acre of corn. That's one. Well, if you grow an acre of walnuts, you'll get an acre of walnuts. That's one. Um, so if you want to get, the two total yields there, you got to have two total acres of ground. But if you take that same acre of ground that was corn and you put 4 rows of walnuts at wider spacing, 50-foot wide spacing, because there's such a wide spacing, you'll get extra light into it. You can put them closer within the row. You can actually fit 50% of a stocking density of walnuts on that 1 acre of ground. So you get 50% or 0.5 of a walnut crop off of that 1 acre of ground. Well, then you still have 80% of the land left to grow corn on. So now you're going to get 80% of a corn crop. 80% plus 50% is 130%. You get a 1.3 in order to get the same amount of yields as you got off of that 1 acre combined. You'd have to have 1.3 acres separate of walnuts and corn. And that has been
Right.
well researched over and over and over again in the agroforestry world. And it follows on most ecological research. Once upon a time, they thought that high yielding polycultures were a result of this plant helping that plant, helping this plant, helping that plant, and so on. And through
Gotcha.
time, like at least during my adult life, from when I was studying ecology in college up till now, it's changed as new things have been learned through time. And now it was just like 4 or 5 years ago that the ecologist basically said it has nothing to do with the compatibilities between plants, etc. Has everything to do with total number of species. So the total number of species per unit area, uh, the higher the species diversity, the higher the total photosynthetic yield of that area. So if I get 100 species out there, I'll have way more total yield than if I had just one.
Right.
Go back to the corn and the walnut example. You know, I actually will get less corn because I'm only growing 80% of it, and I get lower yields on my walnuts, but I get more total yield. So by getting
Right.
lower yields, I get more yield. And it actually does make sense. It's been well researched. people get their PhDs on this stuff.
Well, do you have any data like that for the grapes? And or how are you using the grapes? Are you eating them, or are you trying to make wine out of those as well?
I do a lot of fresh juice for myself. Sold a bunch of fresh juice. I
Okay.
was using it in wine, but since I've stopped doing the licensed winery, I really don't use much except for my own home juicing. And
Right.
what was really interesting is very few people believed me that pigs eat grapes right off the vine. They will actually stand up on their hind feet, unsupported with front feet at all, and they'll eat bunches of grapes. And I told people over and over again that this was happening, and it was finally just a couple 3 years ago. Some guy was doing a video for the Savannah Institute, and he caught this pig eating bunches of green grapes right off the vine. And so, you think about the diet of the pigs that I have. Uh, uh, Ordinary pig, you'll want to have about a ton of feed to get it up to market weight. That's mixed grains that you buy at the feed store or whatever it is. That's a lot of grain to convert into an animal protein. You could be feeding a lot more people with that ton of grain instead of feeding pigs. Cool. So what I do is I start with enough of a feed ration, a grain ration, and it's all organic, grown from neighbors and stuff like that. I have enough of a feed ration to keep a little 30-pound pig alive, and it's about a cup and a half. And then the rest of the season, it has to get its food from the habitat that I've created. And
Right.
its first perennials, aside from grass, it's eating grass first and foremost. They graze quite effectively. They'll go
Yeah.
into currants. Be eating currants, then raspberries, then cherries start, then mulberries, and the mulberries have the longest season out here. They'll go from, sometimes early July all the way till September. Um, then we have so we went to mulberries, and we got early season apples. We've got hazelnuts. We've got oaks. We got hickories. Of course, the mid-season apples, the late-season apples, walnuts. Um, Now grapes are starting to be ready, and then they finish on chestnuts. And chestnuts, like I said earlier, it's nutritionally equivalent to a grain. It's like brown rice or corn. So the pigs will be
Right.
full size by the time the chestnuts start falling, and then they just plump right up, and they just pack on the weight with the chestnuts. And it's right when the chestnuts are falling that we've usually finished harvesting the apples, and then they have free access to cleaning up all the apples. So
Wow.
the pork is a radically different product than a grain fed pork.
Right.
Takes
Amazing.
longer to
Yeah.
cook. It's delicious. Oh my gosh, it's so delicious.
I I I'm salivating. Um, do you so with the grapes, have you considered anything like pollarding? I know it's not your main thing, but if had you considered that or tried that pollarding a tree just to have more of a trellis idea versus the competition that can come from a fully spreading tree?
Well, fully spreading. See, in my situation, I'll use apples again as an example because that's where I have most of the grapes that I use. Is the lower 8 feet because I'm using semi dwarfs and standards. The lower eight
Uh-huh.
feet are almost like an espalier with the branches going within the row, and
Okay.
then because I do that so I can get immediately next to that tree with the mower, and
Right.
any fruit that we pick is the low hanging fruit. We don't go way the hell up in the top of the tree, and then the rest is for the pigs. And so the grapes are just trellised on the lowest branch or branches that are
Where is the
well,
lowest branch start? Is that at around 5 feet, 6 feet? The
no,
low
it'll
branch.
be 2 or 3 feet where the lowest branches
Okay.
start. And then eventually,
Okay.
because what happens is the cattle end up grazing them all off, which is really
Okay.
which is really kind of nice. They'll graze them up to about 5 feet,
Okay.
and what happens is it short circuits apple scab because most apple scab is spread in the fall and then in the spring when there's leaves on the ground that have spores on it. A raindrop hits that spore packet, it bursts, and the spores fly up in the air and then they settle back down to the ground. And they really only, jump up about 3 feet. And so if you have a 5 foot gap to the nearest branch, you virtually, short circuit apple scab. So now you don't have to be spraying fungicides. And I wouldn't want to be spraying fungicides anyways, because I get all kinds of morels that naturally show up in my apples all by themselves.
Oh,
It was
wow.
another revenue stream.
Wow. That's amazing. Um, I mean, have you noticed do you have any just observations or any data about the grapes? Like, I mean, are you counting how many pounds you're getting off an acre of grapes, or do you have any observations about, their just sort of symbiotic relationship with the trees, other than, I mean, the ones that you've already mentioned that they seem to really like mulberries?
Yeah, I don't, yeah, they just do. They just grow. I don't know. They grow faster around mulberries. I don't
Huh.
have any actual yield data, and
Okay.
the ones that I really took care of, I would limit it to 8 clusters per vine.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if that was right or wrong or whatever. That's just what I did, and even that was too much work. I'm really, really liking this not doing anything to my grapes.
Yep.
They're still there. They're not going away. They're not going anywhere. Even if I pull a vine down, even if I don't cut it and throw it to run it over with the flail chopper, it roots in and it makes more vine, and I have more grapes, and I can feed more pigs.
Got it.
If it's ever in the way,
Oh, I
I
love.
just drive over it and chip it up.
Nice. Have you considered, or have you inoculated any of your seedlings with like truffle spores or anything like that? Have you played around with truffles?
Actually, I used to supply a guy down in North Carolina. You guys can go ahead and find him. I don't have to say who he is. I used to supply him with hazelnut trees that he would inoculate with truffle spores. And
Uh-huh.
I have probably 25, 30 trees that I had gotten back from him that were inoculated with truffle spores. And the problem is with truffles, if you want to grow the truffles, it has to be super alkaline soil. And here we're on limestone, so we got a decent soil pH, but they need it alkaline. They want it, seriously alkaline. And it was just too much of a nuisance doing inputs. And I just
Right.
have this aversion to doing input based agriculture. Agriculture is supposed to be yielding me outputs. Thank you very much. It shouldn't be requiring inputs. And so I still have that block over there, and they're surviving. The trees are surviving because truffles are actually, they're saprophytic or parasitic. They actually do uh, damage the tree and will eventually kill it. And so
Ah,
the hazels over there aren't doing well. So I suspect that they've got truffles on their roots. I've never bothered to dig them.
huh. Okay. Fun. All right. Well, that's not. I mean, I don't know. Anything else you have to say about the grapes at all? I mean, or any closing thoughts at all? I don't want to keep you forever, but just love. I mean, I'd love to keep you forever, but I want to be kind to you.
Well, I'm available for conversations at a later time. That's not a problem. Um,
Awesome.
well, I actually probably the comments that I hear the most. There was one person I saw a book review. It was the last time I read a book review, just because this pontificating person with multiple letters and periods after their name, um, about restoration agriculture, which happens to be an Amazon bestseller, and it's only 0.5% of all published books ever make it to bestseller status. So it hits somebody's nerve. Well, this
Yeah.
pontificating professor basically said that, well, this all sounds good in theory, but it's just not practical on the ground. You'll never get enough yields to, da 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 da. And away he goes. And it's like, he has no clue. Most
Right.
people just don't believe that plants grow and that certain plants will grow in certain regions. Don't try to grow saguaro cactus in north central Alberta. It's a really stupid idea. Well, likewise, don't try to grow something that requires, 60 inches of water a year in Central Valley, California. There are
Yeah.
things that are adapted to your place. Every single place around the world, except for Antarctica, has supported human cultures that had art, music, spirituality, poetry. They experienced love. Uh, every single biome on this planet has supported human societies with the plants and animals that grew there. We have to relearn that everywhere around the world, almost like re-indigenizing ourselves to the place. Instead of imposing our will on a place, go to an area, find out what wants to grow there, what will grow there. And I'll use California as an example. I was consulting on a vineyard, and they had a horrible problem with those Luther Burbank blackberries. I mean, walls and walls and walls of these blackberries all over the place. And they wanted my help with the blackberries. I said, well, wait a minute. You run a winery. Here's the solution. You don't have to spray anything on these. You're actually spraying herbicide on these things, and you can't kill them. You're ripping them out of the ground, and you still can't kill them. That's sustainable, and that's low cost because you can't get rid of these things, and they're not diseased. Nothing seems to bother them. So why don't you go ahead and harvest these and squish them and ferment them and make wine? And I was greeted with a nose in the air and a huff. And that's not what we brought you here for. We brought you here to help us convert to organic and get rid of these GD blackberries and We grow wine. We grow XYZ variety of grapes. And it's like, okay, I see we have a problem here. So what the real problem was is that we had a tremendous resource that was not believed, and it was not utilized. It was cost-free except for harvesting and pressing. And they wanted to spend more money to get rid of that so they could plant things that don't want to grow there, that they'll now have to put on life support in order to keep them growing there year after year after year. And there's a word for that in the English language. I call that really, really stupid. Just plain stupid. People don't believe that it's possible.
Well, this brings it full circle to that whole idea of variety and why, I mean, that's kind of what I was getting at, was like this obsession with a grape variety when it just takes us away from this process of looking at the land from what it provides. And that's where we should start, not with our desire to make the best Cabernet in the world or make the best Pinot Noir in the world, wherever we are in the world, but to look at what's there and to find a sustainable form of wine that is actually from that area, that they would have a very unique wine because they're probably surrounded in California by a bunch of people growing grapes that are the same kind of thing that they want to grow, and instead they have this great opportunity to stand out and do something unique with something that doesn't cost them anything, or it doesn't cost them any extra.
And what's really great about this conversation, we started there with varieties and wine. We're finishing here with varieties and wine. What we should have done is we should have been sitting around a picnic table with some olives and some wine and had this conversation.
Let's do that again. Let's make that happen.
Let's do that.
Well, thank you for this conversation, despite the fact that it's virtual and without the wine. But I really appreciate you and your perspective on agriculture. I think it's desperately needed, and I really thank you for sharing it.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be on here, and I've had a really good time, and I hopefully some people can learn something that will change their mind and help us all to live on this planet in a more ecologically sound and sustainable manner.
Well said. I agree. Hey, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And if you're still listening, you made it all this way. You must really enjoy it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please feel free to leave a review. It helps a lot. Or feel free to contact me directly at info@centraliswine.com for any feedback or questions. That's info@centraliswine.com. CENTRALAS wine.com. Centralis is actually my winery. It is the sponsor for this episode until we find new sponsors. So that's why I use that email address. Thanks so much, and look forward to hearing from you.